Hello horror hounds. Hammer's Dracula Prince of Darkness marks Christopher Lee's grand return as the king of vampires, but you have to feel a little sorry for the Count in this. I mean, in the first movie he'd reigned for centuries before Van Helsing finally put an end to him. Here he gets resurrected from the grave, runs around for a couple of nights and then gets put down again by a monk with a rifle.
I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
The movie starts off with a quick, if slightly weird, recap of the end of Dracula 1958, or Horror of Dracula. The fantastic fight between Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. Always a pleasure to see it again. Remember at the time, that movie is 8 years old and there's no local blockbuster you could have gone down to rewatch the movie before you come and see the sequel. Just like now there's no blockbuster you can go down to. The more things change, the more they stay the same. So we get a recap of the final fight, framed very strangely in a diamond at the centre of the screen, surrounded by fog. But nonetheless, it's great to see those two titans battle it out, because we don't get Peter Cushing in this movie, sadly. We do, however, get Christopher Lee. So what the universe gives, the universe takes. The main story begins as a monk, Father Sandor, stops the local authorities from essentially disposing of a young woman's corpse. They want to put a stake through her heart and burn her, and he chastises them in no uncertain terms. I mean, there's a priest there. Dracula got killed 10 years ago. There's been nary a sniff of him since, so your fearful superstitions aren't warranted here. And bang, straight away, we're up to speed. We know exactly where we are, and we're off. Rewatching it, I noticed how Dracula Prince of Darkness is a little like a proto-slasher movie. There's a perfunctory setup, and then we're introduced to a group of people who go to a place they shouldn't. They choose to ignore the warnings of the locals, and then we get to watch them line up and either die or survive as the script sees fit. Here, it's a group of English travellers who are told in no uncertain terms not to go to Carlsbad. And if they absolutely have to go to Carlsbad, please, 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 whatever you do, don't go to the castle you'll find there, the castle that's not on any of the maps. So, naturally, where are they going to end up? So let's introduce ourselves to our four English travellers, the Kents. First of all, you've got the youngest brother, Charles Kent. Ah, Charles Kent. I loathed him from the start. He's so brash, cocky, so sure of himself. So I guess that means I have to applaud Francis Matthews' performance for doing an excellent job in just raising so much bile in me at him. He's joined by his young, pretty blonde wife, Diana, his older brother Alan, and Alan's wife Helen, who's a redhead. If we learn anything at all from these Hammer vampire movies, it's that there's a blonde and there's a redhead, and that the redhead will either get killed or turn into a vampire, or killed and turn into a vampire, or turn into a vampire and then killed, and the blonde will be the subject of Dracula's lust and obsession and will be the one that has to be saved. As it ever was, so it is here. Helen, the redhead, is the only one of the group to pay any heed to the warnings given by the locals, and she's subjected to increasingly infuriating, can't get the words out, increasingly infuriating explanations from the men as to why she's making an absolute fuss about nothing. And I do wonder if this film is, on some level, a sly satire of the English abroad. Ignorant, boorish, ignoring local advice and wisdom, just bluff, demonstratively unaware of their own place in the world, and just believing that wherever they go, they're bringing England with them, essentially. When Helen starts getting really flappy about going to the castle, which they were told not to go to, remember? And Charles says to her something like, if you had your way, we'd never leave England. And Helen said, would that be so bad? And this really is the mentality, this little England, the mentality that we're working at here. And I do think that there's a funny, sly sort of winking commentary about the Brits abroad at play here. Of course, they end up spending the night in the castle, otherwise there'd be no movie. Here they meet Clove, Dracula's manservant. He's keeping the home fires burning and has been for these past 10 years, basically just like a spider in the centre of a web, waiting for the opportunity to present itself so that he can resurrect his master. We've seen the trailer. I've done a trailer reaction from Dracula, Prince of Darkness. Everyone knows that Dracula is returning from the grave. Everyone knows that Christopher Lee is back as Dracula. But director Terence Fisher is mightily happy to tease the return of the Count for almost 45 minutes, basically the first half of the movie. Now, repeated viewings of this film might make this opening section a frustrating watch. If you're doing maybe a marathon of the Hammer Draculas, you want to get maybe to the Dracula sections, but I haven't watched this movie for a long time, and I found the tease and the build-up to be deliciously chilling. Barbara Shelley, the redhead, plays Helen Kent. She carries the entire first half of the movie. She really sells her unease and growing fear and then terror at the situation they find themselves in, the situation that everyone else tells her she's being silly about. Her performance and the atmospherics once they get to the castle add to this delicious chill I mentioned. There's a cold wind blowing through the empty castle, adding an almost surround sound, sort of gothic spook to the whole affair. When they all retire to their beds for the night, it's just compounded by Terence Fisher giving us a roaming camera, or basically stalking the empty corridors of the castle, almost like the spirit of the Count itself, restless, eager to be reborn anew and wreak a new terror upon the land. And at about the halfway mark, that's exactly what we get, and boy, do we get it in spades. The resurrection scene is possibly the most outright violent thing Hammer had produced up until that point, maybe ever. I think maybe when we get to Scars of Dracula we're going to see some more explicit violence, but certainly by this point where Alan, the older brother, is strung up like a hog for the slaughter over the sarcophagus of the Count, and Clove slits his throat and a veritable waterfall of blood cascades down onto the dust, the remnants of the Count. That would have been enough, but the rebirth that follows it is such a superb sequence, a series of dissolves, some more or less invisible to the eye, where you see the Count's body rebuilt from skeleton and then sinew and tissue and muscle and blood, until eventually the tomb fills up with mist and Dracula's own hand, Christopher Lee's hand, comes up and out and curls across the edge of the tomb like a spider. It's probably the best body being reconstituted scene that there is, right up until you get Frank's rebirth in Hellraiser. Hammer's 1958 adaptation of Dracula was a really stripped down affair. Most of what was in Stoker's novel was jettisoned for time, money and streamlining. So Prince of Darkness has the opportunity to add back in little elements from Stoker's novel. We get a character, Ludwig, here, who is essentially our Renfield. He's a madman locked away for his own safety, but you know, a kind and nice enough, gentle soul who eats his flies, but is compelled to obey the telepathic commands of the Count. And once the Count's telepathic influence asserts itself, he becomes violent and dangerous. I mean, he essentially is Renfield. Towards the end of the movie, there's a horseback race back to Castle Dracula against the setting sun. There's also the offer to one of the women from Dracula to drink his blood, this sort of blood sacrament of the counts that Mina partakes in Bram Stoker's novel. Here it's Diana, Charles's wife, the blonde. Dracula's got a thing for blondes in these movies. You know, who can blame him? I'm more of the redhead guy, but he gets to turn them into vampires and they get to be sexy vamps. So for someone like me, it's win-win. Dracula's nocturnal visits are more overtly sexual than the implied sexuality in the 1958 Dracula. And we'll see this throughout the movies. What is permitted in these films becomes more and more, and the Hammer movies push the envelope, and then it'll get to a point in the 70s where they're racing to catch up and go to extremes and maybe push it too far. Here though, they're pushing, the tension is perfect, they're pushing against the sort of acceptable boundaries of what is overtly sexual about these vampire visits and vampire attacks. And there's nothing not to love about that. Christopher Lee sells these scenes amazingly well with just his eyes and the look on his face. It speaks to a conflict in him. There's an aspect that he gives to Dracula sometimes which seems to speak to a sadness, a sense of tragedy that is then overtaken by the lust. There's a strange beatific look that comes across his face when he's offering Diana his blood, which is so mysteriously hard to read, and it basically speaks to the skill of Christopher Lee. He's adding these layers and touches and moments of characterization to a script that absolutely doesn't call for this level of attention and skill, but give it he does. And this is why we tip our hats to the likes of Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, who absolutely always give 100%. Now, according to Christopher Lee, the dialogue that was in the script by Jimmy Sangster was so bad that he basically refused to say it. Jimmy Sangster himself tells a different story and says he never wrote any dialogue for Dracula. I'll be honest, while Christopher Lee's story is good, I'll tend to fall on Jimmy Sangster's side, because otherwise there would be stories of quick and hurried rewrites, probably on set, because by its very nature, if there were Dracula lines that he had to say, there would be other characters' lines of dialogue to him and in response to the lines that he refused to say. It's a good story, Chris. I just don't buy it. If you want to squint, if you want to force in a more solid continuity between these movies, you could argue this lack of dialogue, this hissing and snarling that Dracula does all the way through the movie. Post-resurrection, Dracula is more feral. He's a creature of instinct. You could argue that it would maybe take more time for him to accumulate that veneer of humanity and respectability and put that back in place. I mean, after 10 years, he's only a couple of nights back from the dead. He's probably really thirsty. It's these baser urges that are driving him until he can become, you know, the debonair, suave, aristocratic count that we saw in the first movie. There's nothing in the script to suggest it. It would have only taken a line from the Clove character to sort of add that kind of detail in. So whilst the suggestion would technically be the fans hand-waving to try and make more sense of it than the script does, it's not something I'd reject entirely out of hand. It goes a long way towards papering over some of the differences between the characterization of the Count from the first film and the second film. I'm all for that kind of theorizing and fan explanations anyway. One of the things you'll learn when you watch a lot of vampire movies is that if you have a character like Father Sandor here, who lists off the ways you can kill a vampire, and you've heard of all of them, yep, steak, yep, sunlight, yep, and he introduces suddenly a new one, running water, you can bet your bottom dollar that that's the way the vampire is going to meet their end in this movie. So yeah, while he's going, stake through the heart, sunlight, running water. Hang on, what? Running water? Okay, whatever. I'm not the world's biggest fan of the running water method of killing a vampire. I did a video recently sort of discussing methods of killing vampires in novels and movies. So if you want to seek that out and join in the discussion, feel free, you're more than welcome. Dracula, given this running water thing, kind of goes out like a little bit of a punk, and this is a theme that we will return to in the subsequent Dracula sequels, he never really finds an antagonist and nemesis of the equal to Peter Cushing's Van Helsing. And so where it's necessary for the Count to be put down at the end of each movie, unfortunately you see him facing off against a succession of weaker-chinned young beaux to the blonde who he has his eyes on and his teeth in any particular movie. At least here we get Father Sandor, who is a rough and ready, rough and tumble, you know, bareback horse riding, rifle wielding type of pastor that you can kind of root for. So he doesn't die as hard as he does at the end of the first movie at all, but he doesn't die as weakly as he does in some of the sequels. So there's that. It's not his greatest death scene, but it's absolutely not his worst death scene. So to sum up the slow build-up, some of you might be fans of it. I know I am. Others might find it frustrating. Once you get past the halfway mark and the Count is up and about, the script can't really find much for him to do. But Barbara Shelley is an absolute delight to watch. And the return of Christopher Lee to the role of Count Dracula is essentially worth the price of admission alone.